Okay, it's my real pleasure to interview, I think, for one of the first big lefty media outlets, the VP pick for Dr. Cornel West, Professor Melina Abdullah. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
All right, so Professor, I think the first reaction that a lot of people got when they found out that you were going to be Dr. West's vice presidential pick was that they might not know very much about your background or why Dr. West made that choice. So I wondered if we could start with you kind of elaborating on that to the extent that you're aware of what his kind of thinking was, his mental processes were. Why do you think you were chosen to join this ticket?
I think that's probably a better question for him than for me.
We'll get around to asking him, but sure.
I think for anybody who's deeply involved in movement organizing, they would know me. They've seen me on the ground. They've seen me doing work. I'm a part of a movement that believes in group-centered leadership, which means that we're not in it for our own selves. We're not in it to make names for ourselves or, win paychecks for ourselves. We're in it to really change the world for our people. And so I think people who've been deeply involved in Black Lives Matter organizing over the last 10 years do know me. But I think that people who are kind of looking for someone with fame or celebrity or a background or ambition in politics, they would not, because I never aspired to run for office, never aspired to be a politician.
I think for a lot of people, that is heartening and frankly affirming to have someone in the mix who hasn't wanted to be in politics their entire life, who doesn't have a kind of prototypical pedigree of, I went to law school and I, became a prosecutor and then I ran for Senate or whatever the kind of typical trajectories are that you see. I think there was some conversation, though, about what it meant for Dr. West strategically in this race where, of course, as an outsider candidate, you're not going to get very much media attention. There's basically a blackout of independent candidates. After leaving the Green Party, there were some additional concerns about whether or not the campaign would be able to thrive absent, at very least, the organizational structure of the Green Party and their infrastructure that helps them get ballot access that was already pre-established, and whether or not it might be useful uniquely for a West 24 campaign to have someone who could either, because of fame, bring in a ton of money the way that RFK Jr., I guess, has sort of done. Obviously, his VP is not famous, but she just happens to be independently a billionaire.
Well, right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dr. West and I are both clear that we're running for the people, right? We're running for regular working class, poor people, right? And we're not looking to have someone with a ton of money. Usually someone with a ton of money, their interests are different. They're part of the ownership class, right? So they would have different interests. They're not interested in housing everybody as a human right or healthcare as a human right or examining the way that the federal government spends 62 cents out of every dollar on war, because for them, war and the expansion of empire also means the expansion of capitalism. And we're looking to transform this country and transform this world. And so I think that it says a great deal about Dr. West that what I know about him is that he moves according to what feels right and righteous. And I first met Dr. West in '94 when I was an undergrad at Howard University and have been deeply inspired by his work as a scholar. I'm a professor at a public university now, and his work continues to inspire me. And I've been fortunate as we come up on 10 years since Ferguson, right, to march alongside him or with him in 2014 after Mike Brown was killed, right? And then we were both involved. He was involved, and I was one of the people most deeply involved in the fight for ethnic studies, especially in California. And when the government and the institution was trying to dismantle Black studies and Pan-African studies, Dr. West came to my department that I was chairing at the time and helped to, be very clear that the whole world is watching. You better not touch Black studies. And since then, we've expanded ethnic studies and made it a requirement, both in the state university system and throughout the state of California. So I think Dr. West knows me and I know him. And I feel very fortunate to run alongside somebody, to be the vice presidential nominee with someone who seeks to do what's right for our people, not for, these narrow interests of capitalist class folks.
I think a lot of people are going to be thrilled to hear you speak in those terms. But there have been some other left candidates in the mix from time to time who aren't as comfortable defining themselves as socialist or anti-capitalist or communist or anything on any kind of a spectrum that way. And I will say that this audience is likely to be very encouraged by your fluency with introducing yourself in that way. I mean, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to your politics. I was just reading a little about you, that your paternal grandfather was a German Jewish Marxist economist and member of the Communist Party in Germany who opposed Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's kind of a fascinating convergence of lineages that seem to have happened to make you who you are.
It is a fascinating, very complicated convergence of lineages, especially as a practicing Muslim, right? A lot of times, mostly Zionists will come and accuse me of anti-Semitism when I'm anti-Zionist, right? But when you talk about Judaism and Jewish folks, that is part of my heritage. And my grandfather, Gunter Reimann, wrote the book, The Vampire Economy, which is a critique of capitalism and is really one of the most influential critiques of capitalism in that sphere. For some, it's even considered a canonized work. And so I appreciate that. I also appreciate that my biological father, his son, John Reimann, was a socialist, is a socialist. And I was raised, I remember when I got into grad school and we had to read Marx, right? And we had to read Lenin and Trotsky. And I felt like I kind of don't have to read it because I've breathed it, at least while my biological father was in the home. That said, I want to give a lot more credit than is given on social media and on the internet to my mother, who is the one who raised me. I was raised by a Black single mother, who I think for Black people, we sometimes arrive at socialism because we have a very strong moral compass. And it feels immoral as a Black woman. My mother was a single mother elementary school teacher who raised us in East Oakland, California. We lived in what some folks would call a really rough neighborhood, but it was also a very beautiful neighborhood. We lived in one of the houses on a block that also had several projects, right? And my mother would get home from her job as an elementary school teacher, and she drove an old Volvo. She never got a new car, an old Volvo station wagon. And you could hear it when it hit the block, right? And all the neighborhood kids would run and sit on our front porch and yell, "Time for school." And my mom would sit on the front porch and teach all the kids to read until the sun went down. And, she may never, I don't know if she's ever called herself a socialist, but she practices socialism, right? In the sense that our resources belong to the community, right? In the sense that herself as a college-educated single Black mama could share that kind of intellect with the whole community. So I know that it's easy sometimes to go, well, her grandfather was Gunter Reimann, that's where she got her socialist lens from. But I actually feel like I got much more of my socialist lens from my mother. And I think that's why, even though I don't know many Black people who call ourselves socialists, but I think what we practice when we talk about Black people as being the most charitable, the most engaged, the most, community oriented, we have the greatest sense of linked fate, that is, if you want to classify it as something, it's classified as socialism.
Yeah, I so appreciate that you clarified that and reaffirmed the source of so much of your political ideology came from your mother's side and perhaps less kind of formal, but equally or even more formative ways. And I'm reflecting on my own experiences with a mother who I think at this point would describe herself as socialist, even though I think for most of her life she would have similarly said, well, I always voted for the Green Party. I always had these critiques of the Democratic Party. She tells a very similar story about when she got to Howard and was being asked to read all of these foundational African American history and Black literature texts, and feeling like, oh, I didn't have to read these because these were drilled into my head by her Nation of Islam father, and then
Yeah.
her Buddhist mother, and that kind of a household. So a lot of what you're saying really resonates with me, and perhaps because you have that background, I'm curious how you see the project of convincing Americans in the context of this political race and beyond, that even if they don't necessarily currently identify as socialist, that there is something in that ideology that is for them.
Right. I personally don't care what we call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I use terms like linked fate, right? Use
Mm.
terms like community focused, right? If you think about who we are, working class people, Black people, people of color, we tend to be much, much more community driven than other folks, right? It takes a degree, not even a little degree, a huge degree of individualism to be a capitalist, right? You have to be concerned primarily, if not only, about yourself and your immediate family in order to be capitalist. In order to, if we think about like the Walmarts of the world, in order to take out what they call peasant insurance on their workers, right? In order to say, you know, we don't need paid security in the parking lots, even though we've been told that Walmart parking lots in a lot of cities are the places of the highest crime, and we could virtually eliminate them by putting unarmed security in golf carts, right? But
Mm.
we're not going to do that because that might cost us an extra, $15 an hour, right?
Mm.
You have to be extremely self-absorbed and concerned only about yourself and your, I never use the term ilk, but your ilk, right? In order to move in that way. And I don't think that that's how the majority of us move. So it doesn't matter to me if most people call themselves socialists, if they're practicing socialism. And tell me if I'm being too long-winded, but I have my oldest child is 20 years old and at Howard University, and
Mm.
they are I have three children, so I'll say one of my three greatest joys, right?
Mm.
Um, Tandiwe is co-founder of the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at
Mm.
Howard. They're a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard, which they started when they were 10 years old. Um, and we were talking last night, we were talking about the encampment in the DMV area right there at George Washington University. And we were talking about the uprisings all across this country on college campuses. We talked especially about how people are touting Columbia, which should be recognized, touting USC, which should be recognized, but how there's too little attention being paid to Humboldt State University up at the top of California, where the student body is majority students of color and almost all working class, almost all Pell Grant eligible.
Mm.
And if you look at what they've been doing, and there were, I think, 8 students or so, maybe more, that were arrested last night, that they overtook 2 buildings now. They're calling it Intifada University, right?
Mm.
That faculty there are coming in and saying, we're hunger striking. And I know what Cal State faculty get paid because I'm one of them, right?
Mm.
We're hunger striking until all of our students are released, right? When you look at that, I think the kind of collectivity and socialism, socialist praxis that you see happening among working class people of color is profound and is really innate to who we are. The last thing that I talked with Tandiwe about is I said that I feel like a lot of these young people, especially Black youth, it's because they don't remember a time when Black people simply swallowed our oppression. Tandiwe was 9 years old when Black Lives Matter was born, right? She was like, Mama, this is my fifth encampment, right? I'm seasoned at encampments, right? And she's right. Like there was this 54-day encampment that we did here in LA back in 2016, which was like their second or third encampment, right? And so they're right. Then I said, Tandiwe, do you remember when we were at Occupy LA? And because they brought up the Occupy movement. And I said, do you remember teaching that workshop at Occupy? And they were like, no. And so she and her friend Emilio, so the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard is actually their second or third organization that they started. When they were 6 years old, they started an organization called the Junior Freedom Fighters, right? And they had a 3-point platform to end poverty, to save the environment, and to end all wars, right? So when they had Junior Freedom Fighters, Occupy LA was popping off. And she and one of the co-founders, Emilio, went to Occupy, had the parents take them to Occupy, and they taught a children's workshop. They brought all of their Halloween candy, right? And they had all the kids sit in a circle, and they passed out the Halloween candy. They had this big old bag full of Halloween candy, and they passed out the Halloween candy, one for you, one for you, one for you, one for you. And then they still had a big old bag of Halloween candy. And at first, the kids in the circle, maybe 20 kids, were happy. And then they looked at Emilio and Tandiwe with this huge bag of candy, and they got one Almond Joy, which ain't even the best candy, right?
That's all. I won't stand for Almond Joy slander. I'm a huge fan.
No, I can't. That's the worst candy. Well, Mounds is worse than Almond Joy, I think.
That's true. Yes, that I can agree with.
And then Tandiwe and Emilio said, do you think it's right that we have all the rest of the candy? And the kids were like, no, share. And so then they poured all the candy out in the middle, and all the kids got an equal amount of candy. And for these little kids, it was intuitive, right? Like at first it feels good to get a piece of candy, like it feels good to get a job. But then when you look up and you go, somebody else is hoarding, you did the register cash out at the end of the hour, and you said, I got, even if it's $15 or $16 an hour, but this register brought in $15,000. No, right? And so I feel like many of our folks will never call themselves socialists, but we understand that socialism is the right thing.
Yeah, so I don't mean to overfocus on that word, right? But the problem is, in the context of now the specific political race, the choice to run for president and vice president, as opposed to a broader kind of organizing context, to make a pitch that convinces people, regardless of what you call it, that your vision of how the country should work, how communities should function, how the world should look is superior to the others that are on offer. And as someone who, worked for the Bernie 2020 campaign, there was just so much thinking and discussion about, do we use the word? Don't we use the word? If we don't use the word, what are the policies that are going to help get these sorts of ideas across? Medicare for all obviously was the consensus point around which it felt ideal to mobilize, because healthcare is such a critical issue in so many people's lives. And regretfully, it seems that is a piece of the conversation that's been completely dropped by the wayside by the Democratic Party and many of the elected officials who once were bannermen for the idea of Medicare for all. So I do wonder, since, realistically speaking, this is such an uphill battle for any outsider, even a very well-funded outsider, in quotation marks, like RFK Jr., given the way our media is set up and given the way the two-party system is set up. And in the context of the Bernie campaign, again, it felt like, well, you got to figure out a way for lightning to strike. Given the protests, which you just were talking about, and as we're talking, by the way, right now, the NYPD is mounting an enormous on-the-ground effort against students at Columbia University, and I think, and also the City College of New York. And I'm keep checking Twitter in the background because I'm waiting with bated breath to see how much this escalates. It's a really terrifying time right now, but also a time where people have demonstrated much broader solidarity and investment and putting their bodies on the gears, as it were, than we have seen in a long time. And so I do wonder what thoughts you might have about how to capitalize on the energy in this moment, whether you think there are political opportunities for the left in this moment, whether you're feeling kind of inspired by this moment or kind of terrified about the authoritarianism with which the moment has been met. I mean, how are you thinking about what's going on right now at colleges and universities as students stand up and protest the plausible genocide that's going on in Gaza?
I think that while I'm so heartbroken by what's happening in Palestine. I was with a group of Muslims talking about political organizing just a couple days ago. And one of the speakers was from CARE, Zara Bolu, was speaking. And she was talking about how we all cry every day. How we all cry every day. Like it's impossible to watch I don't watch Twitter as much as I watch Instagram, right? It's impossible to watch Eye on Palestine or even Al Jazeera, right?
Yeah.
And not feel just completely heartbroken. Just I don't know what to call it. Because heartbreak isn't a big enough word, right? Devastated, right?
Yeah.
It's devastating. And I'm a mother, and I'm watching these children. I'm watching these other mothers, right? I'm watching the last one I saw was of a son discover his father in a pile of dead bodies. And that's devastating. And you know, I want to apologize for becoming emotional, but I also am so grateful that I still have emotion, right? That we haven't turned cold, right? That we haven't said there's something to be ashamed of because of my tears.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that. It's been a difficult kind of balance. These people listening to this podcast are so sick of me saying this, but my mother's a stress counselor, and she's been doing these check-ins with me about exposure, and how I'm feeling and emotionally regulating and all of these kinds of things. And it does feel like a certain kind of compartmentalization has to occur to be in the fray and be having these debates every day on my morning show that I co-host with a libertarian who fundamentally will not ever entertain a moral argument, because that's not what libertarianism is about. Every argument is dictated by what he thinks freedom is or what the market will bear. And so even when we agree substantially on something like America shouldn't be funding Israel, he will say that because he doesn't think America should be funding anything, but will not engage morally with anything that's happening there. And I find myself having to then kind of compensate for what feels like a moral void in our conversations by engaging with a kind of emotionality. And that is in and of itself this weird push and pull that has to be negotiated. How to do that, how not to allow the scenario to suck the humanity out of the conversation without constantly sort of going to the same emotional well in a way that might not be sustainable over the long term. So I'm checking myself on how much, do I compartmentalize too much? Have I taken that too far as a protective mechanism? And I'm really grateful for your vulnerability here in this moment, because it just certainly more than warranted. I think the word devastating is the right word to use. And as these conversations get derailed to being all about the student protesters and all about the American public reaction and all about whether or not this slogan or that slogan is the right one, it's so important to keep focused on the underlying tragedy that's motivating all of these people to get into the streets. And that is the devastation that's happening in Palestine right now. So, all that being said, I mean, it does seem like there is a substantial shift that's happening in terms of public opinion. Obviously, it's been weeks now that the majority of Americans support a ceasefire. Israel suffered a number of devastating sort of PR hits with the multiple drone bombings of the Jose Andres humanitarian workers, forcing even those who don't care about Palestinian lives to care about how disproportionate and wanton the violence coming out of the Israeli state has been. You've already alluded to the horrific images of children who have been the victims of bomb attacks, the aftermath of having to endure surgeries and amputations without any medical care. We've seen the flower massacre of Israeli troops shooting starving Palestinians as they attempt to get food aid, and horrific incident after horrific incident. And it does seem to be having an effect on public opinion, so much so that our government, in an incredibly authoritarian move, is willing to ban the app by which so many people are getting their information. But politically, it does feel like, as a member of the left, this is an opportunity for a candidate to emerge that actually is articulating what has become a majority view in this country, which is that this relationship that we have with Israel is detrimental to American interests, and America's unwillingness to hold Israel accountable is fundamentally detrimental to the interests of Palestinians. And I think many people hoped that there would be a bannerman that emerged that really was able to channel that frustration with the Biden administration into a sort of political movement of sorts. And so there's a lot of investment, I think, in seeing what your campaign can do in this moment. You know, how are you thinking about that? I mean, do you feel the same way? And what do you hope? What ideally do you see as sort of the outcomes for your campaign, given the historical moment that we're in?
Sure. So first I want to speak back to your mom and say one of the things, so we feel this devastation, but I was watching this Netflix special, right, on what are they called? Centenarians, people who live to be over 100.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's this common perception that stress and anxiety and depression and trauma kill us. And there's an exception that they found. It's stress, depression, anxiety without an outlet, without where you just feel like there's this devastation, but there's nothing that you can do. So it's really the helplessness that kills you. What these young people are doing, what's happening on our campuses, what's happening off our campuses, because we're almost in May now, right? What's happening in the world, I think is the correct response that feeds our souls, that helps us to reclaim who we are as spiritual beings, not just, physical beings. I do believe we're in a political moment. And I talked with a couple of my movement comrades, and I said, I feel about this moment very similar to how I felt in 2020. So I remember in 2020 when we were all in lockdown. What did we go in March? We went into lockdown because of COVID, right? And I remember first there's this panic, right? And we go, is the world ending? What's going to happen, right? And then there was a moment in there where I was like, this lockdown ain't so bad. I really, my house was super clean. I cooked every night. We all gained a lot of weight, right? But also remember like looking out your window and, seeing birds everywhere. And, it was just this moment. And then as soon as we kind of settled into the moment, we were reminded that the state continues to be what it is. And there was first Run with Maude and Ahmaud Arbery. But then in May, when George Floyd is murdered, and we're all on lockdown, so we can't look away, we erupt. And I was part of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, had been trying to get rid of our district attorney for years, really. And every week we protested her. And with the lockdown, we started doing virtual protests. But after George Floyd, we all got on the phone and we were like, we just got to risk it and get out there. And went back into the streets. And we weren't the only ones, of course. You know what happened next. Everybody's back in the streets. And I remember when it happened, it either was right then or right after that HBO series. It sounds like I watch a lot of TV, but I don't. I just remember the stuff I watch.
Hey, it was lockdown. Okay. No judgment here.
Lovecraft Country came out. Did you watch that?
It was lockdown. I watched everything from Tiger King to Lovecraft Country. There wasn't a show on a streaming service that I had access to, whether through my parents, a boyfriend, or whomever, that I didn't completely exhaust. I was also unemployed. The Bernie campaign had ended. I had literally nothing else to do. Yes, I watched Lovecraft Country.
Good, good. So we watched Lovecraft Country, and you'll remember like this moment when I always use this term. It was a moment when the world cracked wide open, right? Where the mom, Hippolyta, had an opportunity to go through the vortex and be transported to Tulsa, right? Tulsa, Oklahoma, and change the trajectory of the world. But she had to do it fast before that crack closed. I felt like it looked like 2020, that this was a moment when the world cracked wide open. We have a finite period where we can run through that crack in the universe and get as much as we possibly can. We can defund the police. We can pour resources into making sure Black kids, now we have Black Lives Matter, we can say Black, right? Where Black kids get what they need in schools, right? We can do that. And so I felt like 2020 was a moment, and we took advantage of it. I don't know if we did all we can, but I'm grateful that we had a movement to meet that moment. I feel like this is another one of those moments when eyes are open, when people are like, nah, we're not going to be on the side of a genocide, right? We're going to, Medea Benjamin, I said, I get so much inspiration because somebody told me, so I'm 51 years old now, right? And a kind of older sister said, you're 50. You can't be yelling all your life. And then I looked at Medea Benjamin. I was like, she's 70. If she can still be yelling.
Really?
Yeah, she's over 70. And I said, if they boarding flotillas and yelling and painting their hands with blood and going to jail at 70, I can for sure be doing it at 50. And so, I feel like this is a moment when young people who are at the front of it, who have all of the hope and audacity and vision, but are also backed up by many of us who also know that we'd be shirking our moral responsibility to them to let them inherit the world as it is, that we'll do anything. We'll hop on a flotilla. We'll, be 50, 70-year-old yellers. We'll do whatever needs to happen. And I think that that's what this campaign represents, is we're not asking people anymore to just hold your nose and vote for Biden as he funds a genocide to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Vote your vision, not your fear, is what I say.
So then all of that resonates with me. The idea that a crack has opened and there is a limited amount of time to take advantage of it. The kind of, shock doctrine-esque moment that we're living in. That being said, how do you do that? Because the Black Lives Matter example is sort of instructive, right? And I know, and I want to invite you to speak to that if this is helpful, that, you know, you were a critic of some of the now well-reported kind of mismanagement that happened with the Black Lives Matter national organization. And for many people, the financial mismanagement, the ultimate seeming acquiescence to the Democratic Party, who was pushing that it was important to support Joe Biden no matter what, because the threat of Trump justified basically subduing the movement energy for the interest of the Democratic Party. A seeming reluctance to be political, despite the leverage that would have come with marrying a movement like that to the political moment. A kind of backing off of concrete demands that seemed to happen. There were concrete demands at an earlier kind of point in the Black Lives Matter trajectory, but it seemed at the moment when it was most popular, most necessary to concretize that, some of that fell by the wayside. And so what would you say then are the lessons learned from that experience that you want to bring into this campaign, and what can listeners look forward to? I think that people want to hear a path forward, not some promise that you're going to win or anything like that, but they want to feel like if they invest in this campaign, if they give money to this campaign, if they volunteer for this campaign, that it is working toward opening that crack wider at the very least, creating a kind of political infrastructure that will last longer than just a campaign cycle, or at least wresting genuine leverage for a movement to use against whoever the likely nominee is going to be, against, you know, Joe Biden as the lefter of the two candidates, so that something can be dragged out of this moment.
So the first Black woman to run for the vice presidency is someone named Charlotta Bass. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she was a publisher of the California Eagle, a Black independent newspaper based out of Los Angeles. And she ran in 1952 on the Progressive Party ticket. And I think of her every single day. She was a member of the UNIA and the NAACP, which is interesting, right? But she said, win or lose, we win by raising the issues. Win or lose, we win by raising the issues. And, you know, I probably shouldn't like take liberties with that thought, but I have in my own mind that for me, that means win differently, right? It would be phenomenal. And, you know, Dr. West is somebody he's the embodiment of radical imagination. And he says, anything can happen. Anything can happen. You know, Trump can go to prison and, you know, I won't say what else could happen to Biden, right? Anything can happen, right?
Sure.
Right. He's right. Anything can happen. And we're doing more than just vying for the White House. We're saying, let's raise the issues so we can address the issues. What does it mean if we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a genocide, not just morally based on what's happening in Palestine, but what does it mean morally in the United States that we haven't paid reparations, right? Or they haven't paid reparations, right? We have, you know, all of these people living unhoused when we know that it would cost less than 10% of that to house everybody. We don't have Medicare for all, right? Joe Biden is throwing these crumbs, shaving a little bit off of some people's student loan debt when there should be no loan debt because universities should be free, right? And we could do that if we made different choices. I think what we have an opportunity to do with this campaign is I actually believe that this is what most people believe in. And that's what Bernie Sanders did, inject a lot of that into the consciousness of folks, right? Lots of folks, maybe not in the same numbers because they were bought into the idea that you have to vote for a traditional candidate and, you know, they were afraid to vote their vision. But I think the enthusiasm that came, right? was unmatched because people were voting for what they actually believed in. We
Yeah.
give people an opportunity to vote for what they believe in. And I think that that is priceless. So even if we don't win in 2024, right, we're able to say, look, this is building. There will be no more duopoly. There will be no more you have to vote Democrat so you don't get a Trump, right? There will be no more of that. And we're moving in that direction. I also think, and then I'll be quiet, that this campaign, the words of another powerful Black woman resonate with me, a sister named Helen Jones, whose son was a brother named John Horton, who was killed inside Men's Central Jail in 2009. And
Mm.
Sister Helen is one of the most genius people I know. And when we experienced the theft of Black Lives Matter's money and platforms by this band of thieves
Mm.
who paid themselves millions of dollars, right? What Sister Helen, that was a heartbreak for me, right?
Mm.
Because we've been putting our bodies on the line. I'm about to go to court right now because, the police swatted my house with me and my children in it 3 times, right?
3 times. How could they
3 times.
possibly have justified doing that? 3 times.
3 times. 3 times. And the first time was bad enough, right? The first time, was the time I was positive they were going to kill me, right? And
Oh,
I
Jesus.
put myself out there because I didn't want them to bust in and something happened to my children, right? Um, so, you know, when we talk about the theft of our resources and platforms, I think about myself. I think about Baba Keeley, who's been brutally beaten. He's 75 years old, right? Was brutally beaten by LAPD. I think about the sister who runs a Black Lives Matter chapter in Michigan, who was separated from her children, right, for standing up. I think about Britney Martin, who's in prison now as a political prisoner, a contemporary political prisoner, for staging a Black Lives Matter protest in Sumter, South Carolina. Mother of 6 who's been in prison now for 3 years, right?
On
Separated
what
from her children.
charges? What is this part of the? Because we've been talking a little bit on Rising, and I think a little bit here about the Supreme Court's choice not to take up this case that effectively outlaws protests in 3 southeastern states that was motivated by apparently a multi-year effort now to go after DeRay McKesson, who I understand is a figure that people feel some kind of way about. But the principle of the matter is the problem, whatever you feel about him as a person.
Right. That's right. So Brittany staged a very small protest. She organized it herself because she lived in Sumter, South Carolina, but was then the mother of 5, was pregnant with her 6th child, and it was mostly her friends and family who came out. And a white cop got in her face and allegedly she said, "I'm willing to die for the Black. Are you willing to die for the blue?" And they
Hmm.
called it threats of high and something. And they
Oh,
charged her on a
geez.
felony. And I mean, she's been tortured for the last 4 years in prison, forced to have her youngest child blessing in prison. She was disappeared inside the prison system, illegally transferred from a South Carolina prison to an Illinois prison, and she's still there now. So we've been organizing to free Britney Martin, right? When I think about those kinds of sacrifices that have been made for our people, by our people, and then the theft of the resources that came in because of Britney, because of Baba Keeley, because of Sister Sheila, because of me, it's heartbreaking, right?
Hmm.
But one of the things that I've learned that comes from Helen Jones is that our power always comes from the people. It never comes from the money, right?
Hmm.
Our power was never with them in the money in the first place. We never had money until 2020. We were funding it out of our own pockets, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so she said, "I'll take people power over money power any day of the
Yeah.
week."
Look.
Yeah,
I appreciate the sentiment, and as a rallying cry, I appreciate it. But what was it like? How many millions of dollars? $90 million, $60 million, or whatever it was that BLM raised in 2020 that could have
90.
gone 90. Yeah, you remember what it was. And even almost worse than that. I mean, like I said, I sit on this show, a right left show, and speak to my conservative co-hosts and all kinds of other conservatives. And the idea of BLM as a corrupt organization has really taken root as a sort of rationalization for why so many other movement efforts are empty, or are performative, or just kind of like fake woke, like DEI, a kind of, a corporate scam to accrue influence for liberal identifying people at the expense of Republicans. It had a broader effect of tarnishing legitimate left movements. And this is what I want to ask you about specifically. Even within the left, I sense a real reluctance to talk about issues that are germane to particular identity groups, that aren't economic marginalization, that aren't class issues, as though it necessarily is going to be divisive or somehow undermine the credibility of the political project. And Dr. West has faced this early on in his campaign. He had a back and forth with a left political figure named Jimmy Dore, and they had a disagreement of sorts about the role that race should play in Dr. West's campaign and how much it should be emphasized. And I know we're running out of time. We're wrapping up. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of weigh in on how you see the balance, if a balance is necessary, or how you see the role that race should play as you care about and in your personal life have centered Black movements, in addition to other priorities. You've obviously mentioned Occupy Wall Street. You've mentioned longtime advocacy for the rights of Palestinians, among other things. But clearly, Black issues are central for you as well. How does one balance one's own particular interests or whatever group's niche interest as you are speaking to a country and trying to lead a country that still is 70% white, and a country that has been primed to see their interest as dictated by their racial or ethnic identity group, often to the detriment of solidarity, building solidarity along mass kind of class lines?
Yeah. Well, I think Lani Guinier, the legal scholar, says it best when she talks about the miner's canary, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Black interests are not our narrow niche interests, right? What happens to Black people happens to everyone else, right? So everyone has to care about Black issues. We're at the bottom of virtually every single social, economic, and political measure. So when you work towards Black freedom, you're lifting from the bottom so everyone else benefits. When we think about, we talked about ethnic studies, that it began as a fight for Black studies. Now we have what we call liberated ethnic studies that includes Latinx studies, Indigenous studies, Asian American studies, Palestinian studies. That benefits everybody, right? When we talk about Black women earning better salaries, right? Demanding equity pay, right? That benefits all women, right? And so it's really important that we understand that Black people, as Lani Guinier says, are the miner's canary. If we're flown into the coal mine and we die, then that means the miners will die too. Not as quickly as the canary, but they will die too. And so what Dr. West and I believe is that we must begin with Black liberation so that we can get to liberation for everybody else.
Yeah, I love Professor Lani Guinier. I was so grateful to be able to take her class when I was in law school. And I remember that lesson well. And I think it's entirely right. I also, playing devil's advocate, can appreciate how, from a messaging perspective, if you are not Black, but are marginalized on some other metric because you're poor, because you're Indigenous, because you're gay, whatever the issue is, and or the confluence of all of those things that so often happens, that hearing a message framed in those terms might seem like an in run around what your priorities are. And even with Black people, there is some evidence that, and you're seeing this in the numbers of Black people who are now showing interest in Donald Trump or RFK Jr. or an alternative right leaning political efforts, that despite having some racial commitments, there is a way to frame kind of populist policies that frankly intentionally excludes race as coming from, say, Donald Trump, except to make it a target, a negative attribute, right? But otherwise excludes race and is affirmative messaging. That is still appealing to people because it does, they experience their interest as frankly aligning with Donald Trump because they are not even prioritizing their own kind of racial interests at the top of the heap, not over their explicit economic interests. Can I get a job? Are immigrants undermining my ability to find gainful employment? Are they driving down whatever the real or imagined concerns are? And so
Right.
I do. Yeah, go ahead. I think you get where I'm going. Like, wait, it's
Yeah.
one thing to believe that Black people are the miner's canary and uplifting the bottom it benefits us all. And I do appreciate the way that, let's say, Heather McGhee has talked about what you call it, something pool politics, about how there were so many public swimming pools in America. And then when integration happened, so many white communities opted to fill in their swimming pools rather than to swim with Black people. And they were willing to make their communities worse off and deny their children those kinds of privileges to avoid racial integration. And I think that making that kind of a pitch to white people, don't let them cut off your nose to spite their face, is really effective. But that still is a pitch. Heather McGhee's pitch is still a pitch that's pretty directly to non-Black, specifically white interests. In the way that I think saying, hey, trust me, if you help Black people, you'll also be benefited, doesn't necessarily have the same vibe. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't shy away from Black people, right? Black people, when Black people are free, everybody's free, right? We wouldn't shy away from that. And we have very clear policy pillars, right? And so we don't say it's for racial justice that we should have a $27 an hour minimum wage. We say that's economic justice. It is. And who's going to benefit the most is Black people because we're at the bottom of the economic measure. But poor white folks are going to benefit too. And I
most
think
poor people in America are white by virtue of the fact that 70% of Americans are white.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think focusing on the policies allows everybody to come along, even if they're reluctant at first. And at the same time, we do have to get to those crucial conversations about race. We can't shy away from those conversations. But again, I recognize that we are running to be the president and vice president, and we want to really get people rallied and enthusiastic and all in on the ideas that we have for this country and for this world. And so, the other question that you asked about lessons from 2020 is, as one of the original members of Black Lives Matter, we always ascribed to what Ella Baker called group-centered leadership. But I think that what enabled really the theft of Black Lives Matter's resources, and I say that intentionally because Black Lives Matter was not stolen. We still have 33 functional chapters that are extremely effective, even without platforms and money. So it was because of Black Lives Matter Mississippi that we saw those 6 members of the Goon Squad get between 10 and 40 years in prison for torturing Black people in Mississippi, right? It's because of Black Lives Matter Florida that we have an Ending Qualified Immunity Act that we're pushing through Congressmember Ayanna Pressley. So I want to make sure that people know that there's still a movement going, and I can't list all of the things that we're doing. There's still a movement going. But I think that what allowed for that theft is there were just a few people who were allowed in to be able to grab the resources. Ella Baker wouldn't have allowed that because she said group-centered leadership, not leader-centered groups. And
Hmm.
so I think with this campaign, even though we're within the confines of an electoral process that says it has to say two people, it has to say West Abdullah, right? We don't see it as only our campaign. We see it, and you experienced this with Bernie, that they thought we still got a coffee shop in LA that's called Bernie's Coffee Shop. I think he might have been there one or two times, right? But it's still packed with people moving the ideas forward, right?
Hmm.
And now it's actually a place where people are campaigning for us.
Hmm.
So we have to make this all of our campaign.
Hmm. Look, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you, Professor Abdullah, and I hope this is the first of a lot of conversations. And I look forward to hearing you on other left media shows because I really think it's important for everyone in this community to get to know you better. I think we got off to a really good start in that effort today. Thank you again so much for your time. And can you let the audience know where they can find more of you and engage with the campaign and find out more about how they can be helpful, et cetera?
Sure. So I'm Doc Melly Mel on all social media, DocMellymel on all social media. The campaign is at CornelWest2024.com, CornelWest2024.com. Cornell has one L, CornelWest 2024.com. We need volunteers. We need we boycotting Starbucks anyway, right? So skip Starbucks. We need that $5, right?
That's right.
And we need you in these streets to help us, especially in states like mine in California, get ballot access, because the duopoly is automatically on the ballot. We are not. And so we need help getting on the ballot in most of the states. We're on in 6 states now, and we continue to grow, but that's because of people power.
I really appreciate that. Can I tell you a Starbucks, like a fast food BDS boycott story as we wrap here? I can't believe I'm about to admit this on camera, but the other day I was walking home from Rising and I passed a homeless woman and she asked me if I could pop into McDonald's and get her something to eat. And I was like, oh Lord, am I going to say no because I'm boycotting McDonald's?
Right.
Or what's more important here? Helping this woman or getting the Miss McDonald's. And this had happened to me once before. And I had said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And kept it pushing. And this time I was like, Brianna, maybe you're getting a little absurd about this. Let's split the difference. That time you didn't, this time you're going to do it. Okay. So I go in there, I get the McDonald's. I may or may not sneak a fry. I'm sorry, I'm human. And then I come back out with her order. She's gone. Now I'm standing on a pretty busy stretch of street in DC with plenty of people about who may or may not spot me holding this gratuitously large bag of McDonald's. Like, oh no, I got set up. This is a sting operation. Somebody's sitting there with a long range lens about to catch me on camera. Come out of this McDonald's. Oh Lord, this lady got me. And I stood there for a minute. I was like, I don't know what I'm about to do because also I'm on a fitness journey. I don't need to be eating this anyway. Like there's many reasons that I don't want to have this McDonald's in my hand. And just as I was about to just like turn and keep walking home and figure it out, she comes like, she was in a wheelchair. She comes rolling down the street real fast saying, hey, sorry, I'm here. She'd have to go down the block for some reason or another. And I was like, ooh, Lord. Okay, thank you. Bye. The rest of the night, I'm like, she ran up the street. But I really thought they'd like honeypotted me with McDonald's. They knew how to get me.
Next time you got to tell her we doing something else. We can do it.
I know. I learned my lesson. I was like, we're going to have to take a bit of a stroll because, she had mobility issues. So I wasn't fully in a position to be like, okay, let's walk a few blocks, and figure out what to do. So it was like the perfect storm for me, but I learned my lesson. If there is a photograph out of me holding this McDonald's bag, I want it to be known. It was circumstantial. But yes, BDS, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all the listeners for tuning into this episode. If you want more Bad Faith, you can also subscribe to get an additional Monday episode at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Please do take care of yourselves. Please stay safe if you are participating in these protests. I know it's getting really wild out there. And I am so heartened by everybody's willingness to go out and join these encampments and help protect each other, to help keep the cameras focused and on, so there might be some accountability down the line if the worst does come to pass. And I'm thinking of you all tonight as we record this. Do take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.